Well, guys, it has been years of TREX communications instruction. Over a long period of time, you've constantly been asking for us to just shut up and tell you which radio to buy, so we're finally going to do it in this video.
But not yet. We're going to talk about communication planning first.
So Brandon, this is not the first time that we have talked about PACE plans, but it is the first time that we're going to dig deeply into it. We just kind of mentioned it briefly on a video about the Garmin InReach program and the products and the service, which is the cheapest and simplest way to get into Satcom for civilians. If you're in the military, there's a cheaper way, which is the taxpayers pay for stuff. But for some people. But let's dig a little deeper. We got a lot of great questions in that video. Let's dig a little deeper into PACE and building a comms plan.
The common acronym around communication planning is PACE. And PACE is actually a lot more complex than just a 4-letter acronym. And that's kind of what we're going to get into, is just kind of go over the complexity of PACE. We're actually not going to play with any of this gear per se. This is kind of just for decoration. But that's something we're going to get into, is how PACE planning is not actually specific to equipment.
Right, and that is why I always come to you for PACE plan stuff. For the record, I read about this stuff. I dabble and tinker and play with this stuff. You have worked with this stuff.
Yeah, so before I got the TREX, if you guys have seen our content, you probably heard my background before, but just a quick refresh on why am I the one to talk with Isaac about PACE planning.
Why do you draw the short straw all the time?
In the military, I was in the military for 9 years, 6 years, was in Marine Special Operations Command, and I was a Special Operations Communicator. So there's a lot of disciplines that go into that, but one of them is communications planning. And if I had to pick any of the disciplines that I'm most comfortable talking about, it is communications planning. And PACE is at the heart of it. This is actually, you can say it's a basic tool in communication planning, but it's actually, like I've already mentioned, very complex.
Yeah, I mean, it is a fundamental. I think that there's a big difference. We'll talk about civilian PACE later, but a big difference between random guys on YouTube or wherever and guys in the military is, in the military, you have specific missions, you have specific groups, you have specific things you're trying to do, and you work backwards from that. A lot of times in the civilian world, it's like, well, I would like to be able to talk to people on this radio because it's the one that I have. It's a totally different way of thinking about it.
Yeah, for sure. And the capabilities of the military is obviously a lot more as well. Even if you just look at the frequency ranges of the radios that we have as civilians comparatively what the military has.
You are allowed more room.
A lot more. I mean, you hear the frequency ranges, for example, VHF in the military is 30 to 512 megahertz, and UHF goes all the way up to 2 gigs. That's a massive range. We are playing in very, very small portion of that frequency range. So just when talking about radios, which PACE planning involves a lot more than just radios, it involves GPSs and satellite communications. Now, when I say satellite communications, I don't mean specifically these devices. I mean massive soft deployable nodes is what they're called, that have computers and voice over IP phones and routers and switches, all these crazy things, even TAC line servers. There's a lot that goes into PACE planning.
Sometimes airplanes fly over and relay your signals, like the sheer array of devices available to you. Yeah, pretty cool.
So getting into just explaining the complexity, first is let's define what PACE means. So I mean, PACE is a 4-letter acronym. It's primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency. So if you lay that out, that sounds pretty simple. You have a primary means of communication, you have an alternate, you have a contingent, and then you even have an emergency. Now, when you think about planning communications, you may think like, oh, that's super simple. I go out, I have these 4, maybe even more forms of communication that fall in one of those categories, and you're all set. Well, that's what I'm going to explain. It's not exactly that simple. So like we already mentioned, the first point I want to bring up is that PACE planning is not centered around equipment, but communication methods. So communication method is a term that I use. It's not from any textbook or anything like that. It's just what is, for example, the method of communication this radio uses. So this radio primarily is a VHF radio. So this is a clone of a PRC 148. Its frequency range will be 30 to 512 megahertz. Some of these variants can do Satcom, but for the most part, these are used in that frequency range. So the communication method of this radio is VHF. So when I'm determining PACE planning, I would be, planning around VHF, not the PRC 148, if that makes sense.
Yeah. There is a fair amount of interoperability between other VHF radios within the military. So
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, these are much easier to make communications work between other military radios and also even to Motorola's. You can just
Oh sure. Yeah.
front program.
All of these. Yeah.
Yeah, the ability to front program these radios is much simpler than almost any civilian radio. I still probably have the programming tree memorized for the 152.
Yeah.
So,
As much as a lot of people hate it, there's some very cool stuff.
yeah. One other thing to note before we get too much into this is we're going to be referencing a lot of radios. The communications that I specifically did in the military, my background was routing and switching, so CCNA level stuff.
What is that though, for people who don't know?
Yeah, it's actually kind of hard to explain. So,
are you allowed to explain it?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically where you get your internet from, there's kind of two main devices. I'm going to try and explain this as simply as possible. You have switches and you have routers. Switches kind of, this is going to be very, very...
Oh, you know what? We should recommend that people go look at some tech channels. Like, there are people who explain how the internet works.
There's people that explain this a lot better. But so basically internet will come from...
Packet data.
Yeah, it'll come from somewhere magic, basically. You'll probably
It goes down the pipes.
Yep, it goes to your router. This is where like your house will get its information, and then it'll go to a switch, and that's kind of how it gets disseminated to various devices in your house. Now, in your house, everything's wireless. It's going to work a little differently. Generally, you connect it straight to your router, but for example, TREX, we have switches in every room, and we have just a couple routers. So what I did was I primarily programmed or configured switches and routers, and that was my foundation of communications. Actually, it wasn't radios. Now I do know military radios pretty well, but again.
As you started doing cool guy stuff, you started doing more radio stuff.
Yep, for sure. So my role when I was not an instructor, so I did teach MARSOC's communication school for a year. But when I was not an instructor, I was at the team level. And what that means is that I used a lot more radios than I did anything else. I still had a ton of other equipment, but when it came to day-to-day use, radios was the primary communication tool that I used. So, but what I taught in schools, I taught field expedient antennas, so HF, and I helped teach routing and switching, and then I taught wave theory, and don't want to blank on what else. I think that's it, main things. So
yeah.
I taught communications planning. That's the big thing. Yeah, that's kind of
the
what we're
fundamentals
talking
of radios and the planning.
Yeah.
So when you're teaching these different fundamentals, who are you teaching? Are you teaching other people who are planning, or are you teaching the lower level guys who are executing the plan, how the plan works, or
all of them?
All of them.
So as a MARSOC communicator, we are considered multidisciplinary communicators. So that means we have to be able to do multiple jobs. To be clear, in the military, if you're a radio operator, you're a radio operator. If you're a data systems network administrator, that's what you do. But when you get over to the special operations side, you have to kind of do everything, because you'll be off by yourself and you have to do all these things. So we teach a wide range of people. But the school I taught was the entry-level special operations school. It's called MNOC, Marine Network Operator Course. So we have people that are going into the course expected to be comm chiefs, and we have people going into the course expected to be guys like me that were on the team. Generally, the higher ranking are going to require more technical skills. This is actually being able to program these things is not as technical as some of the like planning that comm chiefs have to do. So yeah, I teach a wide range basically, but the planning, what's what we're talking about, applies equally to all of them.
So let's build out a plan. I think I've showed it to you. Somebody sent me a comms plan from a training exercise, and I'm still not supposed to show it to, people who aren't supposed to see it. But it's all declassified stuff. But it is a small, like 4x4 paper binder, but it is hundreds of pages. It is hundreds of pages of stuff. So are those the kind of comms plans that you would develop?
Not that complex. So there's probably a lot of like frequency requests and dealing with crypto and all sorts of things that go in there.
A lot of call and response authentication tables are in there.
Yeah, all kinds of stuff. So when it comes to particular pace planning, the way I teach people is I approach it differently, but I would say everyone is going to kind of agree with me on how I do this. So I lay out 3 key points, and these are 3 points you take to your pace plan before you stop the pace plan. The first one to note is that every operation that you're on will have multiple pace plans, and they are phase specific. So what that means is if you just have one pace plan, it's not going to work for an entirety of an operation. Every phase of your mission is going to require a different pace plan. And to simplify that even further, you can break your phases down into for communication planning side of things, if it's movement or a static phase. So if you're moving, you're going to have different means of communication versus when you're in a stationary location. That's probably the easiest way to break that down. So, for example, say we're going on an operation, we have to drive to get there and we have to drive to get back. My pace plan is going to be different while we're driving versus when we're actions on, and then again when we're driving back. So phase specific, and every phase will have a different pace plan.
This is unrelated to civilian operations utterly and completely. But during the action phase, how much of that is thinking about what signals intelligence capability the enemy has?
Heavily. It's actually the last point that I'll bring up is environmental and EW concerns, as that is going to greatly affect what you're using and where and when. But before we get there, our second point
I knew I was going to.
No, it's fine, because that's going to be the interesting stuff. But the second point I want to make clear is that when you just determine a pace plan, it's for you determining how people are talking to you, and for you to determine how you're talking to your team internal communications. So you're gonna have external and internal communications basically, and they're gonna be different pace plans. So if Isaac and I are just talking, it's probably just line of sight radios. But if I need to talk to someone that's very far away, if I have Satcom capability, it's probably Satcom or HF, right? So that's something to consider. So even if there's only one phase of an operation that I'm doing, I'm gonna have at a minimum right there 2 pace plans, right? So internal and external.
Yeah. Now, I've learned this from the movies. There's a third one, which is when things get really tight, the president calls you on a phone. Is that somebody else's job?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Never mind job.
Willem Dafoe will handle that.
I will say, we may or may not have President Trump call my team house a couple of times on one of my deployments, which is pretty cool. So the last point is actually tying in what communication method will go into what part of the pace plan. So what will be, primary, what will be emergency, et cetera, et cetera. And I balance that off of 3 points. So the first point is how secure the communication method is. And all of these points are going to be very dependent on what your operation is. So some of these points may be heavier weight at other times. So, if in the military, for example, how secure the method is going to be the most important part. The second point will be how well the communication method performs in your environment. So that's obviously a thing to consider. Now, again, with civilians, we don't have to worry about that as much because, again, speaking with just radios, our frequency range is much shorter.
Sure. Well, sometimes that does create some issues. Like we're in an industrial park. I have some small 900 megahertz radios, which are low power, low probability of intercept, but the gas pipeline up the road has a ton of 900 megahertz sensors pinging back and forth.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So our limited bandwidth does actually give us some, definitely you have to know where interference is going to be. So
sure. Yeah, good point there. Yep. So we have how secure the communication method is, the environment concerns, and then how reliable and convenient your communication method is.
Yeah.
So that's something to also consider. So for example, let's say I have 25K dedicated Satcom, and that's a communication method that's based off a radio that can do voice and data. It's very good, it's very expensive, and it's very reliable, but it's not very convenient to set up. So I need a directional antenna facing at a very specific in a very specific location. And if I'm moving on an operation, or even if I'm on foot and we're just doing like a patrol or something, that's not the most convenient method of communication, even though it may be the best form, most secure, et cetera, et cetera. So in that sense, maybe the most convenient form of communication I have is an Iridium sat phone. So I can just call on the phone, it's secure, but it's not gonna be, it's not the best. I can't send data over it, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. So now that you're out, you have access to fewer pieces of equipment. The equipment that you have access to operates in smaller ranges, and then the groups of people that you're talking to are, shall we say, less organized. Like we don't have our own pre-existing systems of like other pace plans we're going to integrate with.
Yep.
So now what are you thinking as a civilian at TREX when everything is less organized?
Yeah, so assigning roles in operations is still going to apply to civilians. Even in the military, and I'm kind of relating everything to how we did operations, primarily on my second deployment because it's just really organized, and how we did things just made a lot of sense to me, so it's easier for me to explain. But nonetheless, when we did planning there, it's going to be kind of the same as how we plan now. So there's generally 3 types of people involved in an operation. You'll have the main effort, and the main effort is the one doing the operation. Everyone is there to support them, and they're actually probably determining the pace plan. Well, they should be on the vast majority of things. Yeah. And then you're going to have two different types of support units. You have general support and direct support. So direct support guys will be there for you, and they're going to be adhering to your pace plan no matter what. So this is probably, when it comes to civilians, the most relevant. Yeah. So if, let's just say we're doing something with airsoft. We go out on operation, my elements, main effort, your elements, the direct support. I'm going to establish the pace plan, you follow my pace plan, because you're trying to communicate to me and support me. Now, the general support is probably not going to relate to civilians at all, at least for now. Maybe you have a lot of friends and you can have someone that fills this role, or at least in an airsoft, if we were talking about airsoft, it probably definitely could apply. But general support will be, in military terms, like medevac, air support, stuff like that. So you have units that are there supporting basically 24/7 different operations happening at the same time. So when I'm determining my pace plan, I don't give them a pace plan for them to reach out to me. They have one established because they have to communicate with a bunch of different people at the same time. So I have to follow theirs.
Does this change? So you were a Marine, you were MARSOC, you always had the initiative, you were always executing the missions. Do you have a slightly different setup, like let's say World War II, where there are communications networks and plans for when you're executing a mission, like D-Day, but then also when you are holding ground and you are being attacked and there's going to be a retreat, there's going to be tactical redeployment, there's going to be something besides a specific planned mission? Yeah,
so absolutely. For example, you can call it a base defense plan, right? So part of a base defense plan, this is generally a very long, drawn-out plan that involves all types of things, but one of them is obviously going to be communications planning. And that's basically going to be, we're at our team house, we're doing our day-to-day activities, whether it's doing laundry, working out, getting ready for the next operation, whatever the case may be.
Receiving calls from the White House, just whatever, yeah.
Exactly. But you have to consider, what are people walking around with on their day-to-day? And yes, we have all of these communication methods like, Satcom, we have highly classified forms of communication, but what people are walking around is their cell phone. So that's primary means of communication, right? So yes, that does exist for sure. And if we are expecting, an attack, or we have just in a defensive front established, it's going to be just, the pace plan is going to be basically established in the exact same way as an offensive operation.
And that is more where a lot of, I think, the civilian pace planning kind of comes in, because we're not planning for a tornado to come through and have to do tornado cleanup. That always happens with pretty short amount of notice, and we don't know where the tornado is going. And so who we actually need to talk to during that tornado cleanup is going to be really dependent on whether it touches down in Nunnally, whether it touches down in Pinewood, wherever. So that is the kind of thing that I feel like is a little more applicable than some of the direct action stuff.
For sure.
And building plans that are more long term. So what are some of your thoughts about that for like just community wide, where again, I keep using the word less organized. I don't know why I keep saying that, but Hickman County.
Yeah, so you're gonna have to find communication methods that everyone has, right? And in the case of a natural disaster, cell phones may not work, but what's the most common, form of radios that we have? And that's CB still, right? So civilian man radios, they're not the best by any means. They're limited on power, very limited on their frequency range, but it's very common. So most likely, and this is actually why I still have CB in my Forerunner for overland trips, is that's what I'm most likely to run into. Still, statistically.
There's a lot of FRS radios around. There are little blister pack Motorola Walmart radios.
But that too. Yeah.
Those are I haven't, in my experience, I haven't run into a lot of people that actually have those up and running. Everybody has those somewhere in their garage.
Yep. And then it's for their kids to play with.
That is a little bit different than the CB radios that are in your car hooked up, ready to run.
Yep.
Interesting.
And there's channels. So the attractive thing about CB radios is that there's 31 channels, correct? If I remember right.
This is weird. Most of my reading on CB radio recently has been from the 70s. The rules have changed a little bit. You still needed a license back then. And so the number of channels is different. But the great thing about CB was there was a comms plan built into the frequencies. It's really interesting. So channel 9 is emergency. There are different channels for north, southbound traffic, east-west traffic, off-road traffic. So if you are off-road and you want to talk to other off-roaders, there's a channel for that. Yep. It's a very cool, simple, ad hoc thing. The FCC didn't throw you in jail if you used the wrong channel. If you interfered with emergency traffic, you might have gotten in trouble. But this is a really interesting thing that I would love to see if we should bring this back for things like FRS radios. There's not a particular trend right now. There's not a particular PACE plan built into FRS, but is that the sort of thing that we could develop and publish and people could just decide whether they want to follow it or not? Like, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, it would be only as useful as it is adopted, because as it is, there are enough FRS channels, there's enough MERS channels that listening to all of them to see if something is going on is pretty inefficient.
Yeah, that's true. So it's unfortunate that CB is so underpowered because of how simple it is. I mean, there's even a channel for just 18-wheelers. So when you're just driving down the highway, what I do is I just turn that channel on and they'll call out police officers that are setting the speed trap, all kinds of things.
Oh, it's classic. They've been doing it, there's in the 70s, there were movies that revolved around this particular capability.
Yeah, so obviously we would like to see, the better capabilities be more common. But again, the better things get, the more expensive they get, the more licensing that's required, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess going back to your question about if a natural disaster strikes, how do we kind of plan our communications around that? So I think you have to start with your primary being what's most common. It's your best chance of reaching people, although it's probably not your best, like literally your best chance. Statistically, it's your best chance. But for people close to you, you should be trying to outfit them with the best possible options.
Yeah.
So.
Well, because everyone in the comments is going to ask this already, what is that best option? What is the magic radio that is the best thing that you would recommend that everybody buy right this second?
You probably can answer this better than I can.
Well, I didn't want to, though.
I'm going to say the VX6R.
The VX6R from Yaesu is a rock-solid amateur radio, and it is waterproof. It's super easy to program from the front, isn't it?
It's doable.
It's doable.
The thing that's cool about it, though, is if it's Mars modded, it can operate it can talk to almost any radio out there. So for me personally, that's a radio that can be your FRS radio, that can be your CB radio, and it can also be a radio that is your ham radio, so it can punch out with a good amount of power as well. So it won't be your encrypted radio, so if you have family members that you want to talk to securely, that's not the solution. Right. But it is a pretty good solution for talking to people on the fly.
It is expensive enough that it's not your buy an entire bushel of them and hand them out to neighbors solution. That is going to be your Baofeng, Pofeng, Wosheng, Guangcheng. There's a ton of different manufacturers of these little Chinese radios, VHF, UHF, dual band analog radios. Those are a great learning radio. Those are a great sharing radio. And thanks to Baofeng and the UV5R, there are tons of them out there. Yeah. The bigger issue in my mind with those radios is not so much lack of capability, but just they are potentially fragile. The other one is they are so accessible that when you spend 20 bucks on a radio, the motivation to learn to use the radio to get your money's worth is a lot lower than when you spend 300 bucks on a radio.
That's a really good point.
And so the sheer amount of unused and uncharged Baofengs that's out there is astronomical, and yet the amount of charged, say, Yaesus in the hands of people who know how to use them is lower, but the number of functional ones might be higher. So this is the thing. If you literally cannot devote the kind of time and money to get into this particular area, the Baofengs do work. The Chinese radios do work. They are, in some ways, easier to program.
They are.
Easier to learn.
They are.
Easier
100%.
to buy for your friends who aren't ready to spend money on. So all of the things on the table have some value and just have a different place in the plan.
Absolutely. Yeah. The other thing about the Chinese radios, you mentioned the price. I mean, you can literally get 15 UV5Rs for one VX6R. So
it is true. Yeah.
I don't even have 15 friends. So like I can outfit everyone I know.
I think you have 15 friends. The problem is a lot of your friends already have radios.
Yeah, that's true.
That's the problem. So one of the things that I do want to talk about in future episodes, I think this is a great deeper dive into the PACE plan, the way that people work backwards from mission, the way that people talk about specific communication capabilities as opposed to just hardware. I think that is a great thing for us to be thinking about. But I do want to come up with something that is a little bit more universal. I mean, it's going to be less helpful for specific things, but it will be a little bit more universal. If we came up with a TREX plan that kind of revolved around GMRS, FRS radios, so people did know, like the TREX emergency plan is channel 3. I mean, the number of people have published random things where it's like channel 3 for 3 minutes at the top of every hour, or every 3 hours, or every 30 minutes. That is the kind of thing that makes radio a lot more accessible without the pre-planning on the front end, which
Correct.
a lot of the times we don't have.
Yeah, that should be a really cool idea. Is even if we just war gamed a little bit, came up with some different scenarios from, everything from tyranny to natural disaster, and a communication plan to fit each one based on what tools that we have as civilians would be pretty interesting. Now, we do have a couple articles on the website right now about pace planning.
We will link to those. Yeah. Those are fantastic, by the way.
Thank you. In those, there's a lot of graphics, and they are centered around military operations. And the reason why I did that is because military operations are very complex, so you get to see all of the different disciplines that can be involved in pace planning. So it does really, really help with understanding pace planning. Even if 99% of it won't apply to you, you can see how many different directions pace planning would go. Still got to finish the last article, but actually all the information about pace planning is already posted. So definitely check those out, and it's a really good way just to learn, again, what pace planning is.
Absolutely. So in the meantime, after people have read those articles and they've picked up a few Baofangs and possibly one Yaesu, what are some of the things that they should do to learn? Like, what's a hands-on exercise that will be educational as a teacher?
That's going to be really dependent on the individual. So I will say, if you get the radio and you're motivated to learn, you've already taken the biggest leap. So the best way for adults to learn is to figure it out. So what I like to do with the VX6R, what I did with the VX6R, my goodness,
yes,
is I just played with the radio, just try to figure it out without looking at any instructions or anything, and to see how far I can get before I get completely frustrated. That's going to get you. You're going to learn a lot more doing that than watching a YouTube video, because someone's just going to show you their way. They're going to just show you how to walk through the software, and you're not going to understand the why behind anything. Understanding the why behind, why am I using this frequency range? Why am I down this branch of the programming tree? That's very, very important to understanding, and also troubleshooting. So think about communications. They don't always work. You have to figure out how to fix them when they do break. And when you figure out things on your own, you learn the why, you know how to troubleshoot. Yeah,
I was going to say, one of the things that a pace plan feels to me like preemptive troubleshooting.
For the communication method side of things, but when it comes to like the technical, it's
technical troubleshooting is a little different. But you are pre-planning how you're going to solve certain problems
for sure.
with a pace plan.
Yeah, and if equipment completely fails, that's what the pace plan is primarily for, is redundancy.
Yeah.
So
troubleshooting. I mean, time and time again at TREX, troubleshooting has been like the most useful skill. The ability to troubleshoot equipment, holster fit, organizational stuff is massive. So fantastic skill to learn regardless of what it is that you're doing. Fantastic skill to learn in the area of communication. Radio communication too, even.
Absolutely. So that's what honestly separated good communicators from great communicators, or even decent communicators from fantastic communicators, was the ability to troubleshoot. And that was on the data side of things, so writing and switching, and even the radio. So everyone who graduates the school knows the menu tree on these radios, and they know exactly how to hand jam and load crypto into the radios. But when something doesn't work, how fast someone can figure out why it doesn't work based on different indicators that are presented, especially on the data side of things, it's a lot more complicated. But even on radios, that's what makes someone really knowledgeable and efficient and proficient on these systems.
Yeah. So have I convinced you to recommend a bushel of Chinese radios for people?
That's what I would do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds great. Not this one though. This Pofeng has some bugs, but it's also like 5 years old. Things have changed a lot on the Chinese radio front.
It has a flashlight, it looks like.
They pretty much all have flashlights though.
Yeah.
Useless flashlights.
It's like solar panels and red dots.
Solar panels on red dots, flashlights on radios. It's interesting to see what the next tactical trend is going to be on cheap gear. Yeah. Whistles. Whistles are coming back onto the next stuff.
They're on backpacks, they're on everything else, so why not?
Very good. So Satcom is one of those things that's incredibly powerful, checks a lot of the boxes. Some of your equipment required complex setup, but This inReach device right here is one of the most convenient to carry, as well as one of the most reliable. What do you think of these inReach devices?
They are amazing. This is the first piece of equipment that I bought for my overlanding and communication equipment because of just how easy it is to use, how reliable it is, and how it just works anywhere. And the peace of mind that you have with that, no matter what, regardless of your cell phone reception, regardless if your radio works or not, maybe I hand jammed the wrong emergency frequency into my radio. I know I turn that on, I can send a text message to a family member or whoever of my choice, or even emergency services, and I know someone's...
Yeah.
There's even an SOS button on the side that will...
that works super well. Yeah. I was just talking to Gaston, the tech prepper, and he was almost the 10,000th rescue with this SOS. I think he's 10,001 or something like that. But yeah, he was on a hilltop, no cell phone coverage. He had ham radio gear, and he's an expert. Could not make contact. Press this button, worked like a charm. So
communication gear always fails at the most inconvenient time.
Exactly. So that is the reason that we carry this device. I have been an inReach fan, and I've used some competitors, some civilian available competitors overseas, and found them way spottier than Garmin's handling of the Iridium network. So yes, endorsed. We're not selling this on YouTube because we sell it in the store. We're selling this in the store because we're going to recommend it one way or another.